The goal for this chunk of the class is mostly just to kind of anchor all of the kind of technical definition stuff we just spent like 2 months on in its place in history. So some of that stuff, pretty straightforward, right? Talking about things like, different activities being pretty different in how they're managed, because some are sport, some are forced and outdoor recreation, and sometimes it's better to sort of divide those and parse stuff out pretty specifically so that you're not trying to use a sport and athletics management approach on like wild natural places where forced and outdoor rec is a primary human use, but completely different in its needs and underlying motivation and reasons and stuff like that from sports, right? So a 20, 30,000 person arena sport is, basketball, football, something like that, is not the right approach for managing a national park, even though there's a lot of fun happening in both, right? They're just different animals, so we manage them differently for each of their specific habitats, so to speak. So this unit is going to sort of take a step back from kind of all those definitions of what's going on sort of currently today in forest and park management, being a forester relative to humans being present. And we're going to kind of go back to the beginning of early archaeological records. Try to sort of understand how we got to where we are and why we now treat sports differently than we do managing backpackers, for example, out in the backcountry. There's some pretty sort of well-connected threads that run from 10, 20,000 years ago, like end of the last ice age, right through today, and aim us into a better understanding of what being a forester is going to be like during your lifetimes coming up, right? So our best way to look at near future is to look at past performance. And that basic idea is going to be present in modeling, in field work, in modeling as in like data modeling and stuff like that, not like strike a pose or blue steel, man, can't wait to see it, Zoolander. That sense of examining our past to understand some wisdom in managing our near future is going to be pretty handy for us as foresters, because we're working on such big timelines, right? This is not, for most of us, going to be kind of a quarterly profit report driven career or mindset or even lifestyle for some of us who are super into it. So let's go back to like ancient China, where the first playable multi-note music instruments were recently found. They were in graves from like 9,000 years ago. Let's go back another 10,000 years before that and kind of trace the roots of civilization and how people have tackled stuff like thinking about wildlands. Yeah. So these days, our entire planet, literally the entire surface of the planet, has been influenced by human endeavor. And a lot of that is under the ocean. But as a result of us, burning fossil fuels and stuff like that, parts of the ocean floor are now dissolving as the ocean acidifies faster than we are, or the ocean ecosystems are depositing fresh material to build ocean floor, right? That's kind of a new development. There is no place, the top of Everest has microplastics, bottom of Challenger Deep, right? We talked about this stuff in class before. So it wasn't always that way. And so people have thought some really pretty different things than what you and I think about wild places. These days, it's a pretty good excuse to spend a lot of extra money on a nice Benelli semi-auto shotgun to, justify for like a really epic hunting trip into a wildland. But it's probably like a state wildlife management area that we're taking it to, because wild areas are now pretty heavily managed. And that wasn't true for a lot of people for most of history up until really, there are just a few places that are unmanaged and wild on the surface of the planet left. So let's figure out kind of how we got there. All right. So if we start off with the ancient era, we're going to trace basically the start of civilization all over the world in different places. And then we're going to kind of focus and shift to the Western Hemisphere. We'll start talking about Mediterranean societies a little bit later, like Greece and Rome, for example. And then narrow down a little bit more, talk about Western Europe and parts of sub-Saharan Africa briefly. And then we'll focus on the United States, before it was the United States. And from there, we'll get into what's kind of early modern America like. So like 20th century, 1900s America, when we were inventing the Forest Service and inventing the National Park Service and inventing things like the National Wilderness Preservation System and the National Trail System and the National Water Trail System and the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and the Endangered Species Act and all of these different ideas as we kind of narrow down and get a little bit closer to what you and I recognize as our society today. Okay? Cool. So let's jump in at the beginning with the end in mind. The whole goal of this is to figure out where we've come from so we know where we're going and understand how we might tackle some thorny management issues, because as foresters, we are facing some pretty intractable problems. Intractable is a 10-cent word for hard to pull, right? We're facing some pretty difficult stuff. So that's not something to shrink back from. It's all right. So if you think back to what archaeologists are looking at as some of the first cities, you're typically going to hear the phrase the Fertile Crescent. So for those of you coming from a Christian tradition, there were 4 rivers flowing out of Eden, wherever that was. There's a whole bunch of competing theories on where Eden was. It's interesting reading for paleo river studies, as it turns out. 4 rivers flowed out of Eden, and 2 of those were the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. All right. Pishon and the Gihon were the other 2, and those are no longer surface-flowing rivers. But that only puts us back about 6,000 years. So we're actually going to jump back briefly to even before this. So this is like pre-epic movies about places like Ur, right, where Abram left to go to what would become modern-day Israel, for those of you interested in that kind of history. All right? Back in ancient Turkey, which is not real far from this, actually. Mesopotamia is like, if Turkey is here at the northeast corner of the Mediterranean, the Fertile Crescent, the Tigris and Euphrates, are like just down here, flowing out to the Persian Gulf, where maybe your parents or uncles fought in Operation Desert Storm or Desert Shield, to kind of put it on the map. Okay, so modern day Iraq and Kuwait are where Mesopotamia once was. The Persian Empire back then. But before that, in what is now modern day Turkey, we have not quite cities, not quite permanent settlements maybe. We have places like Göbekli Tepe, which is being excavated on an ongoing basis, and it looks like the oldest sort of permanent structures, a bunch of stone, basically altar sites, religious sites, stuff like that. Places where people, mostly nomadic people, so hunter-gatherers for the most part, but they would kind of go home for the big family reunion to go back to Tepe and other places like it. That dates out to about 17,000 years ago. Okay. Now we have cave paintings from earlier societies before that, which actually record even earlier senses of play, leisure, in addition to sort of basic life maintenance activities like hunting, right? So if you think back to kind of your mental stereotype of a cave painting, maybe in Lascaux, France, or any of the other places cave painting, that are more than 10,000 years old. So back when like Neanderthal and modern humans were mingling in Southern Europe and stuff like that, To this day, there are some people groups across Central Asia that have like up to 20% Neanderthal DNA ancestry. Did you know that? Pretty cool stuff. But those cave paintings, in addition to showing like this is the animal that we killed, basically different cloven hoof animals, most of which are still around, a few of which are extinct. In addition to those, we have, you may be familiar with these, paintings and silhouettes of people's hands, where they essentially grind up and combine dried berries and flower petals and mineral pigments and load those into a straw-like tube, maybe like a reed, maybe, and sort of blowgun the back of their hand and create an outline of their hands. And there are children's hands in those, and evidence of sort of a playfulness in that painting. So, even back when we were basically chasing things down, like early Stone Age humans and stuff like that, into Neolithic, we have recorded examples of people having any time, any spare calories beyond just making it through a cold winter and not freezing or starving to death. We have parents recorded playing with their children and doing cave painting, right? Literal finger painting. Pretty cool stuff. But those records are pretty thin, they're pretty few and far between, and they're hard to pin down very specifically in time, even if they are very specific in their geographic locations. Not all caves are suitable for cave painting and stuff like that, and so it's a pretty exciting thing when any more of those are found. Zane? Oh, let's see. Cave paintings at Lascaux, what, 20 to 25,000 years ago, I think? Maybe? Let's look that up. I don't want to misquote that for you. Siri, don't fail me now. Cave paintings at Lascaux. Not even close. All right. That was close. The age of the paintings is now usually estimated at about 17,000 years ago. So around the time of people in the Eastern Mediterranean starting to set up the first, at least the earliest that we found, the first semi-permanent, not villages, not cities, not towns, just settlements, where they might converge like after the big fall hunt. Tradition is to come here and do a bunch of trade and everybody hang out and maybe do some sacrifices or whatever religion they practiced at that time. In some ways pretty recognizable and in some ways totally alien to us. But that's 17,000 years ago, and as humans develop things like agriculture, starting animal agriculture and like what will become row crop agriculture, around 10,000 years ago in that particular corner of the planet, we start to see a shift in things like surplus time. In that leisure time pie chart of subsistence time and existence time, and a tiny little wedge for, okay, let's go play now. Social historians, the folks who are not interested in like kings and queens and generals and like famous individuals, but like how everybody else lived, they suggest that there was a real sort of continuous blending of leisure. It was a very sort of domestic thing where backpacking, not really something most people are getting into 17,000 years ago, at least that we have many records of. We do have a few people recorded as ice mummies or glacier mummies in various places, northern Scandinavia, so a few spots in the Andes. Certainly there was the land bridge from Kamchatka, eastern Russia, over across the Aleutian Island Range, what is now the Aleutian Island Range, and so forth. But most folks are pretty nomadic. And some folks are going to stay nomadic for a very long time. So the folks that who will later be ancestors of the Uyghurs of Mongolia, central steppes of Asia, for example. That's still a traditional and nomadic lifestyle. We'll talk more about how that has played out since this ancient time when we get up to that point in the timeline. But back in the day, the idea here is that play was a very important, even survival tool or skill acquisition thing that early cultures used. And before we have any evidence of even semi-permanent settlements like at Göbekli Tepe 17,000 years ago, we're looking at hard to call groups of people cultures. They're just small, mostly nomadic clusters of people, right? So we don't have any evidence, or we don't have any reproducible evidence of language, of specific religious practices that identify larger groupings of people back that far, because writing wasn't invented until quite a bit later, with cuneiform and stuff like that, and hieroglyphics. But we do have this early sense that, okay, people had enough time to gather at places like Göbekli Tepe. That's very suggestive of a surplus of calories. It's not everybody clawing out everybody else's eyeballs to get the one gazelle that somebody managed to bring down. There's time for travel, and there's time for annual sites to visit, and so on and so forth. So think about what that was like, right? For those of you who have been backpacking and camping, imagine what life might have been like for them, such that they could travel hundreds and hundreds of miles every year to come back to a place like Göbekli Tepe, year after year, century after century, generation after generation. And to be able to do that in the face of things like infant mortality being what feels astronomically high to us today, but even today with our modern medicine, humans have the highest risk natality and carrying fetuses to term of pretty much any mammal. The cranium to pelvic aperture ratio is not in our favor for women surviving that, unfortunately. So think about what that means. You're effectively a backpacker, and you're backpacking around, hunt out an area, gather whatever wild edibles are present in that place. And even in that, you have some time and you have some space for play, recorded in things like cave paintings. So, pretty different life than what we're used to these days. Like, if you've ever done any long distance backpacking, it is basically a fantasy to plan to hike the Appalachian Trail or something like that and gather all the food that you're going to need along the way. Because you can spend 12 to 14 hours a day gathering food in some of these forested environments here in the eastern Appalachians of the United States. And that's your whole day, right? Much less walking a whole bunch of miles per day. So, things were pretty tough, but they were also not so killer that folks didn't have time for play. Anthropologists, folks who study the human condition, what gives rise to things like culture and language, and the ability to settle into a place like the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia here, and start the first cities. Anthropologists think that based on studying pretty much every current primitive society still intact and in existence these days, play, leisure, what we would call forest and outdoor recreation these days, is a very important thing to survival in primitive cultures, or indigenous cultures, or aboriginal cultures, depending on your view on it. So, think about how every little boy and a lot of little girls and lots of little kids like to find a stick and turn it into what?
Sword.
A sword. Or a gun, these days, right? So when you have kids playing with sticks and mock fighting and mock hunting, that is practice, in addition to being pretty fun, right? So when you see a bunch of grown-ass adults waving lightsabers around, that is sort of modern echo of this early, very human, very recognizable instinct to learn by proxy. We're not actually hunting, we're not actually sword fighting, but we're picking up the proprioception, like what's the muscle memory, what's the series of combinations of movements, how do I need to angle each of my many joints between my hips and the tips of my fingers to swing a sword in an effective way. Do I need to pivot at the hips, right, like a boxer or a baseball player? Do I need to just swing my arm and move my body in a different direction to get away from the other person's sword, right? Play gives us a chance to proxy that stuff and try it out and see what works. And fail early, fail often, fail forward, right? So if somebody whacks you in the midsection with their stick sword, then, okay, that's important feedback of, I shouldn't move like that next time. And we can go back to it without any real serious wounds. Okay, make sense? All right, so next time you have the urge to like grab a stick on a hike and either use it as a walking stick if you're old and tired like me, or, you know, play fight or throw the stick to your dog, for example, I want you to think for a second of what sort of survival skill does throwing a stick for my dog to fetch, what primitive survival skill or aboriginal survival skill does that mimic or proxy? Because it does. Okay. All right, let's jump forward from Göbekli Tepe and the very earliest recordings of any kind of even semi-permanent human dwelling. We have the earliest cultures, right? So, Mesopotamia. It's the kind of a sequence of nation states that started in between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They flow parallel to each other and then join right before, or they conflow right before flowing into what's now called the Persian Gulf. And it's a pretty great place to get early agriculture in place, which is how that became a permanent and relatively highly productive place agriculturally for thousands and thousands of years, about 6,000 years to be precise. And the idea here is that as we start to plant wild varieties of cereal grains, well then we can just let the sun do the work, let the soil do the work, and let the annual floods around the Tigris and Euphrates and soon afterwards the Nile River channel, right? These entire societies are built around, they live and die by that annual flooding regime, which brings in a whole bunch of new fertile silt and deposits it on these low river terrace, what will become row crop farm fields after some centuries. And so while you're letting the sun and the rain and the soil do their work, producing grains for you, not super high efficiency yield, right? 2, 3, 4, 5 times the grain produced versus what you hand cast out there before we learn to plow. We still have, that still leaves plenty of space for building things like gardens, which are a weird thing to build if you think about it in an early society, and vineyards, which make perfect sense because water's full of deadly microbes and most people are going to die by uncontrollable vomiting and or diarrhea in this era. And parks. 6,000 years ago, we have parks. Now, these are not quite the national parks that we have today. Those are a different animal. But these were at least semi-natural spaces, like the gardens, inside what were eventually really big cities. Really big cities where everybody is pretty much on foot or on horse. First horses were domesticated, what, about 10,000 years ago? And Mesopotamia is, let's draw a really terrible map together, right? This is not GIS class. All right, so here's the Mediterranean. And we've got Italy and Greece. And then we've got Turkey. And we've got the Black Sea, where eventually Putin will be torpedoing grain shipments. And then we've got kind of the Middle East, so Asia Minor. And then we've got Northern Africa, the Atlantic, and we've got, let's see, got a couple of bodies of water that kind of go like this. And the Persian Gulf is this one. So the Tigris and Euphrates are basically flowing from southern modern-day Turkey, southeast to Persian Gulf. In between here is where we have Mesopotamia. And then a whole bunch of cultures that you will find noted in all throughout the Old Testament if you read the Bible or other parallel religious texts, the Quran. We have a lot of things flowing from this area at this time, right? We get some of the first legal codes because when you coop a bunch of people together in a college town or in ancient Mesopotamia, you got to have some rules, right? And we get things like these parks. So what's going on in early parks? Think about this for a second. Today we have the entire surface of the Earth functionally conquered, right? We're changing the climate of the entire planet. We are changing the ocean, the global ocean, like the one ocean system, but across the entire planet, radically and real fast right now. Back then, we're still in a stable garden climate, the so-called stable garden climate. Everything's a little bit cooler, and everything's a little bit more regular. We don't have the amped up cycles of a turbo-heated climate going on. So, we still have droughts. We still have disastrous floods. In fact, every culture in this area has a flood, like a globe-ending flood, just like the Bible does, recorded for this area. So we know that, like, catastrophic, what felt like to them world-ending floods are a thing. It shows up in every culture at that time. Pretty cool stuff. Epic of Gilgamesh even. So we have people with excess calories and laws, which means we have lawyers, and parks. So we have the parks, as far as we can tell from what not great historic records exist from that time, as a flex. That's right. The first parks appear to be a humble brag of people with cool names like Nebuchadnezzar and Xerxes and Artaxerxes and Cyrus and so forth. These people that show up in ancient history sort of throughout. The idea here is that if you are a ruler and you need to show people that you're powerful, one of the ways to do that, and there are many, is to take the wild, the dangerous. People living on the outskirts of these places are getting dragged away by honest-to-God lions, right? Like, that's a thing in everyday life for a lot of people back in the day, right? The wildlife was really pretty wild back then. We didn't have, highly engineered terminal ballistics. That was not a concept back then. We didn't have like anti-materiel rifles or big game hunting or anything like that stuff. It was like, okay, yeah, there are lions out there, and good luck. So going from settlement to settlement is a non-zero problem. If you play MMOs, this is like the high-level zone in between each of those, like, non-combat villages that you can go into and can't draw your weapons in. A lot of stuff doesn't make it from early city to early city. It just disappears. In fact, 4,000 years after Mesopotamia, there was an entire Roman legion that marched up towards Scotland, right? The far western and northern extent of the Roman Empire, before it started its slow collapse. An entire Roman legion, 4,000 years after one we're talking about, marched up towards Scotland and disappeared. Like, a whole ass legion got murdered, got ganked, right? So this is kind of life for everybody through this 4,000 year period. This is life in its nasty, brutish, and short, according to Hobbes. That's Hobbes the philosopher, not the tiger. And parks are a part of that. So if I'm an emperor, or I style myself an emperor, and my armies, my generals are good enough to conquer a couple of vassal states around me, that I'm going to keep as vassal states, I'm not going to absorb them into my own empire to protect us and throw those guys under the bus so that the barbarian hordes riding horses from the rest of Asia across the mountains here, these people were terrified of highly mobile, highly armed, highly trained soldiers and just roving bands of people. Like, they would send folks over here and never hear anything back. I mean, imagine, like, if we sent people to Kentucky and we just never heard from them again, right? Like, that's kind of some of these distances we're talking about, right? There's like a mountain range right here cutting off these people from these people, and eventually people start to figure out, ooh, we could get our horses through here and just murderalize people. Just, they will face tank us and they will thank us for it, So, these parks are a way to show people, hey, we are so powerful that we have a section of the wild that is tamed. It's safe. It's known. And I made it that way as Emperor so-and-so, or King so-and-so, or Queen so-and-so. And that means one thing. These parks and ornamental gardens, like one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Hanging Gardens of where?
Babylon.
Hanging Gardens of Babylon. This is that time period, okay? The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were a real thing. And if you think about how heavy water is, and how heavy soil is, to have basically gigantic hanging planters on a step pyramid palace, that's like major BDE. Like, that is a huge flex to everybody anywhere around that says, you know what, we are successful. We have tamed the elements. And some of these cultures, in particular the Egyptians, eventually started teaching their people that their pharaohs, the men and women in charge of that particular dynasty at that particular time, we're actual gods. Like, we have control over nature. And you better toe the line, or I'm not going to make the Nile flood. And we'll all starve. Or you'll all starve. I'll be fine in my palace. Does that make sense? Alright, so the earliest parks were partially about power and control. And so the access to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, not for everybody. Not for you guys as regular commoners. Not for me, because I'm a commoner too. In most all of these societies, greater than 99% of everybody is everybody else. We're the ones tending those fields. And we're doing all of our agriculture literally by hand. We don't even have horsepower yet. A horse generates about 700 watts of continuous effort to draw a plow, or oxen a little bit more, to turn grindstones to crack grains and separate the germ from the hull and stuff like that, so you can eat tasty bread that's not like eating cardboard. We're still getting to that point of using horsepower. So 99+ % of everybody is a serf, living on land that is somebody else's, producing, and a big chunk of that flows upward toward the city, toward the palace. And a big chunk of the serfs get levied into armies each spring, and they go fight everybody while the crops are growing. So this was life, as far as we can reconstruct it, back in the day. Now, it wasn't just like, this is Sparta, all fight all the time, and you're either a farmer or a fighter or a pharaoh. Right? There's all of the other sort of trappings of culture starting to come up at this time. Things like organized religions. We probably had religions way before 4000 BC, right? We think Göbekli Tepe, more than 10,000 years before this, we're about 10,000 years before this, was primarily a religious and trading and sort of cultural exchange site. Kind of like eBay back in the day. If eBay also had church or something. Anyway, pretty different than what we're used to here in the United States. But some cultures to this day operate basically on this idea, where the national parks are for the national leaders, not for everybody in the nation. Okay? So pretty different than what we're used to. And this is going to be a thing for a while. Let's take a look at how that kind of evolves, right? So let's jump forward 3,000 years, closer to us, 3,000 years, right? That's a lot of generations. To Babylon, which is also like right here, because these civilizations grow and then they hit like a mini ice age or a protracted system of drought, like we do here in the United States as well from time to time, right? So the Dust Bowl of the 1930s is an 85-year drought cycle for the American Southwest, and about 85 years ago. It's all very exciting. It's a good thing we don't have any mega droughts going on in the West right now. That'd be terrible. Moving on. We jump forward 3,000 years, and it's kind of more of the same. But Babylon, with 3,000 years of social innovation, has some somewhat different ideas. Right? So we're now squarely in the Old Testament, for those of you keeping time score that way. And Babylon is a warring country. They are highly effective militarily, and so places like modern day Israel, right here, and this will be the West Bank where all this fighting is happening right now, right? People here, Semitic peoples, get conquered and get exfiltrated as tributes, not volunteering as tribute to save their little sisters, like, we are dragging your asses back to our capital city, and you guys are collateral. So if the hoi polloi living in modern-day Israel and a whole bunch of other places nearby that get conquered by the Babylonians, later the Persians and stuff like that, we're gonna slit the throats of everybody that we're hanging on to. So this is a pretty common thing, right? One king defeats another, and the defeated king is allowed to stay, send tribute, mostly in the form of material wealth and skilled people, and the prince or the princess, the monarch's son or daughter, or sometimes big chunks of their extended family, also get sent over to the conquering, the winner's capital city as collateral. Just to make sure everything stays cool, you don't get any funny ideas, right? This is strategic hostage taking. So these Hanging Gardens of Babylon right? It takes a couple thousand years for culture to get to the point of, okay, how are we going to get water to the tops of this like 80-foot ziggurat step pyramid palace that is also a religious center and also that major flex of, look, I have tamed nature. It's in these little hanging pots. And by little, I mean the size of a Geo-Metro. Geo-Metros haven't been a car for a long time. I apologize. The size of a smart car, like several ton planters, and a whole bunch of slave labor and sort of early pumping systems to get water, which is 1 metric ton per cubic meter. It's heavy. Up to the top of a ziggurat every day. Okay, so again, we are preserving the sense of parks as a way of defining what we are as humans, in particular what our rulers are, versus everything else out there, where the barbarians on horses are. The Persians later on after Babylon are going to have a son of a bitch of a time with getting wrecked while they're trying to wreck everybody else. Right? The Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, like this place has changed hands so many times, it's ridiculous. All right, so that's Babylon. Across the southern Indian Ocean, or northern Indian Ocean, we have the subcontinent of India. And 8,000 years ago, we have a bunch of people called the Wagon People. This is the best name we got for them. They're the Wagon People because we have evidence that they buried their dead in graves, like respectfully, and they had wagons. And that's about all we know. They spoke a language we now call Proto-Indo-European. So, Wagon people are like right here. And India is like here. And the Himalayas, right there. Or the Himalayas, depending on your accent. Right there. So, language as we understand it spreads from right about here to everywhere. See how close this is to the Tower of Babylon, right? So a lot of this stuff is at least hinted at in what historic records we do have. Yeah?
Are they technically the Indo-Aryans, or is that later?
Say again?
Are they technically the Indo-Aryans, or is that
Indo-Aryans come later. Great question. All right. So we're talking about the Dravidians. But not in any detail. You don't need to memorize this. Proto-Indo-European is the language that predates, like, all the European languages, pretty much. And a whole bunch of the languages spoken on this subcontinent. And those will later spread through the Roman Empire and later the Pax Americana to all over the world. And now we have a descendant of Proto-Indo-European American English as kind of the lingua franca, the language of business around the world. Okay? So, people are spreading. Ideas are spreading. Languages are spreading. Okay? From Proto-Indo-European, we get like Proto-Germanic, and that spreads all across Northern Europe and into Scandinavia. We get like Frankish languages, things that will become Latin, and like Latin, Greek, the Semitic languages around this area. So Hebrew, Aramaic, the language of the Egyptians at the time, all spreading from here. And so are a whole bunch of cultural ideas. In India and in China, we have much longer continuous records of civilization. So they're not quite as old as some of these others that we've been talking about, but we do have a more thorough accounting of what's going on there. And in India, the Dravidians and so forth, we have pretty excellent records of at least kind of a nudge toward what we understand as forced and outdoor rec today, right? Nothing that we do today is going to be remotely recognizable to anybody from back then because we're using and we're assuming things like airplanes and firearms and material sciences like composite compound bows made out of space age carbon fiber nanotubes, hybridized carbon lattices. Pretty cool stuff, right? They're not thinking along those lines. This is still, the wilds are the place to march an army through, and maybe if you're Alexander the Great, actually get to a whole bunch of other places, meet interesting people, conquer and slaughter many of them, and then sort of bring them into the Alexandrian Empire. Alexander, a little bit later than when we're talking, made it as far as India. There are Greek or Macedonian descended folks in a couple of villages and a couple of mountain passes accessing India. It's really cool stuff. Anyway, but folks in India started to put out this idea of public rec areas as a function of their spiritual or religious beliefs. Now, we still have some spots that are like not for the unwashed masses. Like this is the Kardashian tier stuff, and then, you know, there's like, you know, you might get like a little garden plot for the rest of us, but it's a start. It's one of the earliest official senses of, okay, maybe it's not just our God Emperor of mankind in the 41st century, 41st millennium, that gets to have parks and gardens and stuff like that. Maybe it's better for the ruler if everybody else is a little bit happier too. I mean, that's such a communist idea, right? But here we are, several thousand years ago, figuring out stuff like, oh, if you're not just taxing people and extracting value from them, they can be happier and healthier and might live a little longer and be a little bit healthier and produce more value for you as the great and storied leader. So India gives us a very, very important switch or shift away from these hunting reserves are for royalty only, period, and you're going to get executed if you do anything in them. Like looking at this stuff the wrong way, peering over the wall into it, punishable by death in some of these cultures, okay? Pretty different than what we're used to today. If you've ever been on the business end of a conservation police officer, you might feel like we're still in this mode, but, you know, CPOs are just trying to do their job. All right, let's go way far east now. We'll just introduce the idea of Central Asia, Southeastern Asia, and ancient Chinese culture. So we have a couple of different people groups, and any of you guys see the old Disney movie Mulan? Okay, this is based on a real problem. We've got the Great Wall of China, which is amazing. It's literally visible from space. I believe it's one of the only man-made things that is visible from space. Skylab and Mir and International Space Station, places like that. Like visible from hundreds of miles away. It's pretty big. It was also kind of a strategic failure. Like it never actually held anybody back. The emperors, a whole chain of them, built the Great Wall of China because those same super aggressive folks on horses causing problems for the earliest civilizations, very similar to the same kind of dynamic, just rolling eastward into like the Beijing coastal plain, where folks have been living and growing rice and developing that culture for, what, 6,000 years continuously? About 4,000 BC? And those folks in the high Asian steppe 10,000 years ago domesticate horses. They make the first roads not long after. Our very first evidence of paths and roads comes from these people's ancestors, the Mongols. Okay? Or the ancestors of the Mongols. later on, going into Western European history of forest rec, we're going to talk about how Genghis Khan, the Mongol, recreationally was slaying, like, not slaying in the sense of like crushing dates, but like slaying in the sense of like killing so many people that afforestation happened across Asia and it cooled down the whole ass climate of the planet measurably. Like, that's a lot of people, right? And about a quarter of all people in Asia have a literal direct genetic connection to Genghis Khan. There are lots of ways to spread power, and gardens aren't the only one. You spread the seed quite a bit. We gotta end there. We'll come back and pick it up on Thursday with ancient China.